priest. He was priest staff in the local post-secondary institutions in the area, so obviously in the same job that I do right now. And he was talking about how he very intentionally tries to embody certain key virtues that he associates with spiritual fatherhood. Right? So, as we expect, he started naming these virtues that you might expect. The idea of being spiritual father, the sense of being strong, being supportive, being present. And then all of a sudden, all this in passing, he said, also I try very intentionally to be vulnerable. I try very intentionally to be vulnerable. And I remember kind of listening to that kind of on the fly and thinking like, oh, you know, there, you know? The notion of vulnerability being a good thing as opposed to something that kind of hide, ironically. Right? So the virtue of vulnerability, and specifically the virtue of vulnerability, which is meant to be in service of the vocation of fatherhood in general, and spiritual fatherhood in particular. So it just kind of struck me. You know? I have to admit, I didn't really finish listening to the podcast. I kind of stopped shortly after that, but it kind of played in the back of my mind, you know. And it's kind of funny how God will sometimes like revisit certain themes that are meant to be kind of important for your own spiritual journey. So again, this was like about a year ago, and fast forward to about a month ago, I was watching a TV show. And I don't watch a lot of TV actually. I watch a ton of movies, but I don't watch a lot of TV. I was watching this TV show called Superman and Lois. I've always seen the first episode, episode 1, the pilot episode, you know. And you know, it's one of those things where obviously it's about like Superman, right? And his love interest, Lois Lane. So the idea, the premise of the show is that they're now married, and they have these twin boys. Jonathan, who's kind of like a confident football jock type, right? And then Jordan, who is not so much. Lacking a sense of style, lacking a sense of confidence, and someone who's diagnosed with social anxiety for which he's taking medication. And so the idea is that, okay, so here's Superman, his wife, we get the joint idea of raising these two teenage boys who happen to be twins. Now, going into the show, I kind of had certain expectations. I thought, okay, I know where this is going to go. This whole thing's going to be about balancing work and family. You know, it's the metaphor for life. Because this whole idea of like, well, I'm responsible for the world as Superman, but at the same time, I've done my family. Okay, maybe I've done that. Let's see how this thing plays out. And it's not to say that the TV show doesn't do that. I mean, certainly that is addressed in the central premise of the show. But early on in the first episode, there's a bit of a twist. Really kind of unexpected. So, as you know, Superman's alter ego is Clark Kent. So Clark Kent, you know, in the aftermath of saving the world yet again from nuclear disaster, he's talking with his mother on the phone. His mother's name is Martha. This is shortly before Martha actually dies from a stroke, right? So Clark is talking to Martha, and Martha is kind of gently scolding him or chiding him for not spending enough quality time with his family. And initially, he kind of rolls his eyes and he's like, well, yeah, you know, I am Superman. I have a responsibility to the world. And she kind of rebukes him and he says, well, no, I mean, you have a greater responsibility to your family. And then she has this really great line. She says, the boys need to see in you what it looks like for a man to be strong and to be loving and vulnerable as your father did for you. The boys need to see in you what it looks like for a man to be strong and loving and vulnerable as your father did for you. So then, well, there it is again. You know, theme of vulnerability. How about that? And I remember thinking at the time, like, I wonder if they're going to develop that over the course of the show. They're just kind of named this kind of interesting point and kind of leave it hanging. But to the show writers' credit, they actually developed this theme in the context of this one episode. Primarily in the context of this relationship between Clark and his son Jordan, who again suffers from social anxiety. So early on in the show, Clark again, he comes back after saving the world from nuclear disaster, walks into Jordan's bedroom, and Jordan's playing a video game. And it's a fighting game, you know, involving the characters from Mortal Kombat and DC Comics. It's relevant to the story, right? So basically, the two characters are like Raiden from Mortal Kombat, and ironically, Superman. And at this point in the show, it's kind of funny, neither of his boys realize that he's actually Superman. That kind of comes up later on in the show. So at this point, all they know him they just know him as Dad and Clark Kent. So anyways, Clark sees his son Jordan playing this game, and there's Raiden and there's Superman, and he just assumes that his son's playing Superman. He goes, oh, that's kind of neat, you're playing Superman. And Jordan responds by saying, no, Superman is boring. So it kind of breaks Clark's heart. You know? And it works on a couple levels, right? Because first of all, I mean, that is the problem when it comes to portraying Superman in films or TV shows or whatnot. Like, because Superman is so perfect, so without flaw, so without blemish. Like, how do you make the guy relatable? It's always difficult when it comes to portraying Superman in terms of stories, even in the comics, right? And so the whole idea is that, well, Superman is so perfect, so unrelatable, and therefore he is boring. Right? But the statement also works on a different level. It speaks to the relationship between Clark and his son Jordan, right? Because again, here's this guy who was laboring with social anxiety. And this is no small thing, right? Isolated case, but the whole idea is that this is not some just acute moment of suffering. Anyone who's ever labored with psychological issues, right? Usually it's over a long period of time. It's like the suffering that you carry close to your heart. So it's a very acute and personal thing, but painful nonetheless. And so, in a certain sense, the idea is that, well, look, why would I share my vulnerability with you when you're so perfect? Because if you have no sense of what I'm going through, if you can't relate to you, or you can't relate to me, I can't relate to you, then if I share my experience with you and you have no sense of what I'm going through, you can say nothing which is useful because you don't have that grounded advice and experience, I'm going to feel worse because now it's not just the experience of my suffering, now I'm alone in my suffering. Thanks, Dad. So what happens at the end of that scene, even though Clark says, hey, you know what, we can talk whenever you want to talk, the son just ignores him. And it seems rude, but it's actually a vote of self-protection. Because why would I share my vulnerability with you when you have no idea what it means to be vulnerable? Now, later on in the show, Jordan meets this girl, re-meets her, I guess. Like, it's someone that he knew from his childhood. Her name is Sarah. And what happens is strongly implied that his latent superpowers, which he discovers over the course of the first episode, they're kind of awakened through the love of this girl. Right? So, again, early on in the show, what happens is Sarah invites both Jonathan and Jordan to this party, right? And she's offering her phone number. But instead of offering her phone number to the more confident, collected Jonathan, she bypasses Jonathan and goes straight to Jordan, which takes Jordan completely by surprise. Like, why would you give your phone number to my more confident brother? Why don't you give it to me? So the idea is that he's being received and loved in his vulnerability. And again, it's a metaphor for life, right? Like, so powerful is that experience that makes him stronger, right? It awakens the power within. Now, fast forward, that theme is played out even more. So they arrive at the party, and all of a sudden, like Jordan and Sarah are talking, and they're sharing their kind of mutual experiences, right? And to Jordan's surprise, he realizes, oh gosh, like Sarah's going through a lot of the same things that I'm going through. So it's like, okay, you have psychological issues for which you're taking medication. Me too. I've had family issues, I have psychological issues, I'm taking medication to help me deal with my own stuff. And it's such a powerful thing for Jordan because the first time he's kind of realizing I'm not alone. I'm not alone in the struggle. Here's someone else who I admire, who is going through a similar thing like I'm going through. And so powerful, so intense is that experience. He doesn't know what to do with it, so he leans in to kiss her without realizing she has a boyfriend, so it's kind of awkward. Anyways, at the end of that episode, there's a shift for Clark Kent, So the bulk of the episode, he's kind of lamenting the fact that, gosh, I'm not the perfect dad. I'm not strong in the way I want to be. I'm not perfect. And I don't have it all together in the way I want to have everything put together. And so, like, what do I do with that? But then at the end, he kind of shifts gears, and he takes a chance to become vulnerable. And so he has this really great conversation with Jordan on the porch, basically kind of acknowledging that, he's always had good intentions. He always wanted to be a good father, but at the same time, he recognizes that, I have failings. I'm not perfect. And he asks Jordan for his forgiveness, they reconcile. And ironically, that's when the bond is forged between father and son. Because now it's like, again, I'm not alone in my pain, I'm not alone in my struggle. Here's someone who sees me and knows me and loves me. And it's not just anyone, it's my father. It's a very powerful experience for Jordan. So the episode sort of ends with that. Now, the reason I bring this up in the context of Holy Week, Palm Sunday, and the aftermath of the Passion narrative is because this theme of vulnerability is actually a really prominent theme when it comes to the Christian faith, in a way in which is often overlooked by even practicing Catholics. Vulnerability is a distinctive characteristic of the Catholic faith. And before I kind of expound upon that in a slightly more abstract sort of way, I want to kind of focus the thing a little more specifically by telling you about my last haircut, actually. So, I have this barber who's a practicing Muslim, and he knows I'm a Catholic priest, and a lot of times we talk about our respective faiths. And I know that sounds like the beginning of a joke, practicing Muslim and Catholic priest walking into a shop. But my wife. So last haircut I had was like Monday, as we're kind of talking, and he was doing his thing. So he was telling me about the Muslim experience. Specifically, this idea, this practice that they have of like washing thoroughly before they pray. So I knew about that loosely, but just the way he described it was kind of neat, just the way he broke the thing down in terms of details. So you probably know Muslims, when they pray, before they pray, they wash themselves very thoroughly, right? And it's not just obvious stuff. It's not just like washing the face, but he went on to say we wash up to our elbows. So very intentional in that regard. We make sure to wash out the fingernails. We even sprinkle water on top of our hair. And where there's skin, where there's hair there, we're very intentional about making sure that the water touches the skin past the hair, as opposed to simply allowing the water to kind of bead on the hair. So very interesting stuff, right? So I remember listening to this, again, this was this past Monday, so it was fresh, right? And I remember thinking two things. First thing I thought was that, the Muslim people are very good at protecting and safeguarding the transcendence of God. The Muslim people, the Muslim faith, it's very characteristic, really good at protecting and safeguarding the reality of the transcendence of God. So who is God, right? God is all holy. God is all powerful. The Alpha and the Omega, the creator of the universe. And what's implied there is that demands our reverence and respect. Not in a minimalistic sort of way, but our utmost reverence and respect, which should be translated in terms of concrete action. If it remains sort of theory, then it's not really real. It means that I don't really respect and have reverence for God in the way that I should. Right? And how the Muslim people express that, apparently, is by washing themselves very thoroughly, for example, before prayer. So that's the first thing that came to mind. Second thing that came to mind, though, is obviously, what do we believe in contrast? What are the points of contact? Where do we diverge in a certain sense? So it's important to be able to answer this question. Right? So what do we believe in contrast when we hear that thing about what the Muslims believe? It's kind of interesting. It's a variation of the Catholic both and. So we believe that God is transcendent. All those things I just mentioned, right? God is all holy, God is all powerful, the Alpha, the Omega, the creator of the universe, all those things. God is the one who deserves the utmost reverence and respect. All those things are true for Catholics as well. But we also believe that the transcendent God has made himself into a child shivering in the cold. Nativity Story. Right? We also believe the transcendent God has made himself into a slave who suffers and dies naked on the cross for the salvation of the world. The whole idea is that the transcendent God has made himself immanent. The transcendent God has allowed himself to become vulnerable. And that, I must suggest, is the great novelty of the Christian faith. It's not one or the other, it's both and. Now for us, that has two very important implications. Right? You think it through, right? The Son of God, who is God himself, has made himself immanent, made himself vulnerable. Implicitly, it's an invitation to relationship. It's an invitation to intimacy, because what is intimacy but shared vulnerability? He steps forward in the stance of vulnerability. It's an implicit invitation for us to do the same. We meet in the middle, therein lies relationship, therein lies intimacy. But if you consider the fact that Christ has done this for the salvation of the world, well, that means something else, right? Because we're all called to be disciples of the Lord, right? Not a matter of simply head knowledge, but a matter of being, to become other Christ in this world. Which means we're called to respond to the gift of Christ's vulnerability by being vulnerable ourselves. Not simply for the sake of relationship with God, but also to participate meaningfully in the salvation of the world. Because Christ chose to make himself vulnerable, he suffered and died on the cross to bring about again the salvation of the world. Now, the example that comes to mind in my second parish was St. Leonard's in Brampton. And the Knights of Columbus, around Christmas time, they dropped a cool $2,000 to buy a whole whack of books. Right? So it was a special. So the book was called Rediscovering Catholicism by Matthew Kelly. So basically, if you bought a whole bunch of books, you can get it for $2 a piece. And the idea was that they were giving out these books to families at Christmas time to become sort of like a Catholic coffee table book. It was meant for lapsed Catholics, for following Catholics. So it's precisely what it says. So it's meant to help people rediscover the key tenets of the Catholic faith. Right? Now, I have to admit, to this day, I haven't read the entire book, so don't tell me that's a promise of gratitude. Right? But I remember being struck by the beginning of the book. We have one copy of the Loving Library, so don't come all at once. Right? But the very beginning of the book, it talks about the three key philosophies that you find in secular culture. The three key philosophies that you find in secular culture. So basically, they're individualism, hedonism, and minimalism. So individualism, hedonism, and minimalism. So individualism is like the exaltation, obviously, of the self. The exaltation of the self. Who's the most important person in the world? Obviously, it's me. Right? So individualism. Hedonism is all about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. And minimalism is sort of similar, but slightly different. So maximum reward, minimum effort. Now, the thing I want to suggest to you is that those three different philosophies, what do they have in common? What they have in common is fear. Whether we're talking about individualism, hedonism, or minimalism, the common denominator is fear. Fear of suffering, fear of pain, which ultimately amounts to a refusal to be vulnerable. Even when you think about individualism, right? Like, how come I can't take my eyes off of myself? How come I can't stop being inwardly focused? Because I'm afraid of losing myself, so I can't leave room for the other. So I'm constantly obsessed with myself. Individualism and hedonism and minimalism, they kind of speak for themselves. It's kind of interesting. John Paul II talks about this. He wrote this great document on human suffering. He says, it's kind of funny. It actually is possible to live your life in such a way, create routines and structures and whatnot, to minimize the amount of suffering and pain and inconvenience you suffer in this life. It actually is possible. If that's your modus operandi, if that's the driving force of your life, there is a way to live your life to minimize pain and suffering and inconvenience. He goes, but the thing you've got to realize is that it always comes at this terrible price. It always comes at the price of your humanity. If you're afraid of suffering and pain, you do everything in your power to avoid that at all costs. It always comes at the expense of your humanity. And it's just a natural thing. Just think through it, right? How can I have deep and meaningful, authentic relationships and friendships if I'm not willing to trust? How can I have a meaningful romantic relationship if I'm unwilling to risk having my heart broken? How can I participate meaningfully in the salvation of the world if I refuse to receive the vulnerability of the crucified Christ? You just can't. It's very much in keeping with Matthew 16, right? Whoever wishes to save their life will lose it. Whoever wishes to lose their life for the sake of Christ in the kingdom of heaven will actually save it. It's a very paradox of the Christian life. You got to stay in that space. One final example, I'll end with this. So I mentioned at the outset, I don't watch a lot of TV, but one more TV example. Right? So this is from Netflix, actually. So there's a kind of a one-man show. It's a stand-up comedy special called Homecoming King by this stand-up comedian named Hasan Minhaj. Right? And basically, it won a Peabody Award. I had to look that up. What was that? So the Peabody Award is basically for excellence in storytelling in various forms of media. So it won the Peabody Award in 2018 or something. So highly recommended. Again on Netflix, Homecoming King. Now, the first half of the show is all about Hasan Minhaj's experience being a Muslim immigrant coming from India to the United States. So a lot of stories and anecdotes related to that. The second half, though, this is the reason why it's called Homecoming King. It's all about him trying to work through the pain that he experienced during his high school prom. Working through issues of pain and suffering and woundedness and ultimately forgiveness and reconciliation. So really interesting thing. So technically it's a one-man show, it's a comedy show, but really deep too. It's the reason why it won the Peabody Award, so highly recommend it. Anyways, as the story goes, when he was younger, when he was in high school, Hasan was in this class with this Caucasian girl who he names in the show as Bethany Reed. So obviously it's not her real name, we're trying to protect her identity, but for the sake of the narrative, her name is Bethany Reed, right? And as he puts it, they were both in AP calculus, but they had chemistry. So in the aftermath of this kiss kind of stolen during the study session, they thought, hey, you know what? Let's go through prom together. Right? And so what happened is, Hasan got dressed up in his tuxedo, didn't have cars, he was riding his bike to Bethany Reed's place. And he arrives at their home, and all of a sudden the door opens, and it's Bethany Reed's mom. And he looks over her shoulder, and he sees like, gosh, there's another guy. There's a Caucasian guy putting a corsage on Bethany Reed's wrist. And what happened is that Bethany Reed's mother said, "Oh, honey, didn't Bethany tell you? I mean, we like you. It's great that you and Bethany study together, but we have a lot of family and friends back in Nebraska, and prom night's a really special night. It's gonna be a lot of photos taken, and we just don't think you'll be a very good fit. But if you want, Mr. Reed can drive you home." So of course, Hasan had this really long and lonely bike ride back to his place, and obviously that wounded him terribly, so much so that he created this whole show built around that. Now ultimately he forgives Bethany Reed, but in a certain sense the turning point is a conversation he has with his father, and this is in the show as well. Right? So apparently his father suffered from a triple bypass, and so he was in the hospital, and it's amazing how the key moments of suffering and tragedy and death, even though his father had died, they can kind of bring out great moments of truth and honesty. So we're in this hospital situation, and again the father's recovering from the surgery, and he's with his son Hasan, and then Hasan is telling his father about the prom situation, telling him for the first time about Bethany Reed. And so his father says to him, "Hasan, I'm very disappointed in you. Hasan, I'm very disappointed in you." He goes, "Yeah, I know, Dad. I shouldn't have kissed the girl." He goes, "No. Why don't you forget Bethany? Why don't you forget Bethany?" And he's like, "What? Like, what do you mean?" Right? He's like, "Well, no, look, think about it like this. When I first moved here from India to the United States, 1982, I saw TV and whatever, and I thought if I let you go to a school dance, you'd become a drug dealer, join a gang, get a girl pregnant, all in the same night." Right? And so that was my negative bias with regards to Americans and American culture. And who knows what they think about us as like an Indian people. So we're afraid of them, they're afraid of us. The whole point, you can't allow yourself to be governed by fear. But this gave rise to this really great line, and I'll remember this forever. What he said was that your courage, Hasan, your courage to do what is right must be greater than your fear. Your courage to do what is right must be greater than your fear. So Hasan, be brave. Hasan, be brave. Hasan, be brave. Now, obviously, that's a very specific, isolated example, but I think you can sense enduring lessons for each one of us. Right? When you reflect on your own life, reflect on your experience of life in the world, life can be really painful at times. You don't have to understand that in any sense of the word. Like, life can be extremely painful. And the actions of people around us, including and perhaps especially in services, people who are closest to us, their actions can be many times disappointing and hurtful. So it's not a matter of putting blinders on this thing or seeing these things with rose-colored glasses. Like, this is the world in which we live. Right? But the point is this: you must never allow yourself to be defeated by your experience of pain. You must never allow yourself to be defeated by your experience of pain. To kind of allow yourself to transition to a space where your primary motivation in life is to simply avoid pain and suffering and inconvenience. If you do that, if you let that happen, in a certain sense, you've lost the whole point of Holy Week. Right? You gotta hold firm. You gotta toe the line, right? Your primary motivation in this life should always be to do the will of God, to persevere in doing what is right, no matter what the cost to yourself. And what if you're inclined to kind of doubt the veracity at that point, or to kind of fall back or flinch because you're afraid? Think back to the Christ child shivering in the cold. Think back to the crucified Christ suffering and dying naked for the salvation of the world. Or, if it helps, think about Hasan Minhaj's father. And put yourself in his space. And imagine God the Father saying to you those same words, which I'm sure in a certain sense he spoke to Christ himself in the Cusp of Holy Week. Jesus, be brave. Hasan, be brave. Sons and daughters of Christ the King, have courage.